through working on a year with Mordecai Kaplan with the Jewish Publication Society, people always ask me afterwards my favorite Kaplan quote. And I always say it's when he said that the foremost problem of Jewish religion is how to get Jews to take the Bible seriously without taking it literally. And I think that that's part of what we are always doing and what this whole day is about, taking our sacred texts, including the contemporary sacred text, seriously. So what I love about Kaplan that applies here is I was reading Kaplan's diaries, which Mel Skult so beautifully has shared with the world, and he was in Savannah, Georgia in December of 1928 to give a lecture, and he recounts in the diary of how he spoke at what was their Jewish community center, I guess, and the night before, there was a basketball game between the Jacksonville and Savannah Jewish athletic clubs with 450 people in attendance, compared to when he spoke and gave his lecture, there were 100 people who were there. And what I loved was his comment was, personally, he wrote, I think it's a good percentage, and as for fostering Jewishness, I believe the basketball game can compare favorably with my lecture. So what I loved about it is that Kaplan saw in the lighting of celebrating candles, of every activity that we do that celebrates Jewish culture and civilization as a whole, as equal to the study. Now, when I had the privilege of studying with Kaplan my first year in rabbinic school, in his apartment, as I talk about in the book, one day someone asked Kaplan what he thought our mission in life was, and he immediately answered, to be an Or LaGoyim. But being Kaplan, he didn't stop there. He, as he is wont to do, he turned and challenged all of us. Why? Why is our mission to be an Or LaGoyim? And after several students shared whatever their ideas were, he said simply, Proverbs 20:27. Proverbs 20:27, which is actually why I have inscribed Proverbs 20:27 on the wall of the sanctuary at Kehillat Israel in the Palisades. Proverbs 20:27 says, Ner Adonai Nishmat Adam, which I've always translated as the human soul is the light of God. Except for Kaplan pointed out, it's not the light of God, it's Ner Adonai. It's the candle of God. So it's not just that we have divine light in us, we are literally the candle, meaning we are literally the physical presence that brings the light into the world. And that's our challenge, for us to be that physical presence that, like the Ner, like the candles that we light, to manifest the light of divinity itself. And I thought that was one of the most powerful lessons about light that I ever learned from Kaplan, that it doesn't say Or Adonai Nishmat Adam, it says Ner Adonai Nishmat Adam. So you wanted a brief Devar Torah? That's my brief Devar Torah. And Chag Sameach to everybody. Have a wonderful Hanukah in which we all do our best to bring our own unique light into the world.
I thank Steve for both his profundity and for his brevity. And I want to move us on. For those of you who are with us a few minutes before the beginning, you saw some excerpts from Kaplan's diaries provided to us by Kaplan's foremost explorer of his diaries, Dr. Mel Skult, who is the executive vice president of the Kaplan Center and an academic advisor. We're always indebted to Mel for his scholarship that appears everywhere all the time. And in a moment, I'm going to ask Mel to introduce our two speakers for today. And but before, I want to go over some procedures for everyone, particularly several folks who might be new to the Kaplan Center with this particular lecture. So the first reminder is the Kaplan Center is trans-denominational. So if you feel connected to Jewish peoplehood, you are in the right place. Thank you for being with us. Second announcement, you're being recorded. That's because we have many people who have signed up for the webinar who can't make it today. We want to be able to share that. Third critical announcement, please remain muted during the whole time of the presentation. At the very end, we will have some time to unmute and hear from some of you and some perspectives and responses to the webinar. We welcome that, but that won't be till the very end. So please remain muted. Last reminder, the best way for us, we encourage questioning, of course, and the best way for us to get those questions is through the chat room. So if you can put your question in the chat room, it'll be monitored by Dr. Eric Kaplan, our other vice president, and Eric will be pulling out common threads and putting some questions back to our presenters. We also give you the option of sending a direct email to Eric if you're more comfortable with the email route rather than the chat. And I think with that, I will turn it over to Mel to introduce our speakers to move forward with our program. Mel?
Well, it's both a pleasure and an honor to introduce Rabbi Deborah Waxman and Dr. Elias Sachs. Rabbi Waxman is, of course, the president and the chief executive officer of the movement called Reconstructing Judaism, which includes both a group of congregations and the Reconstructionist College. Rabbi Waxman and I go back a very long time, and before she was the president, one of her minor duties, I would say, was to supervise the archives at the Reconstructionist College. And I spent years going through those papers, and Rabbi Waxman was always enormously helpful and very gracious in granting me permission to quote from the papers. And so I am always grateful to Rabbi Waxman. As in her new office, she draws on her training as a rabbi, as a historian, to be a leading voice in the public square. And we appreciate her talent and her ability very, very much. Dr. Elias Sachs is director of the Jewish Publication Society. And I must say, Dr. Sachs, I have a very special place in my heart for the Jewish Publication Society because many years ago, I fell in love with Henrietta Zold. My wife never minded. I was 11 years old when she passed away, but she, in a very strong sense, really founded the Jewish Publication Society. There were men that were around, but it was Henrietta Zold that did everything. She was editor, she was the really director in a very significant sense. And so I am enormously, and she was also, I would maintain, the first conservative female rabbi. If one looks into her biography carefully, you see that. And so I am very happy to introduce Dr. Sachs, who was previously director of the program in Jewish Studies and associate professor of religion at the University of Colorado in Boulder. He is the author of a primary work on Moses Mendelssohn called Living Philosophy, Practice and History of Judaism, as well as articles on Maimonides, Spinoza, Hermann Cohen, and Franz Rosenzweig. So we are very happy and privileged to have both Rabbi Waxman and Dr. Sachs here today. Thank you.
You.
Okay.
Yes, Deborah.
Great. Right before I begin, I want to share with you that Elias and I agreed last night as we were doing our final conferring that we wanted to offer this session in memory of Rabbi Dr. David Ellenson, Sadiq Hador, a great man of this generation. Philip Klutnick was a major real estate developer and philanthropist. He was a Jewish communal leader of the highest order. He was Secretary of Commerce in the Carter administration, and he was a Reconstructionist. In his 1991 memoir, he wrote, "It was in 1935, at the age of 28, that I was first introduced to a book whose thrust was to have a decisive impact on my understanding of Judaism, its needs, and my response to them. I refer to Mordecai Kaplan's Judaism as a Civilization." Klutnick provided for his readers an admirably brief biography of Kaplan and summary of Judaism as a Civilization, and then he concluded, "The theoretical and practical aspect of Kaplan's book, taken as a single whole, gave me a feel for something I had been groping for all along, a synthesis between Judaism as a religion and Judaism as a culture, both in harmony with my aspirations as an American citizen. I underlined in pencil many paragraphs in my copy of this book, all by way of saying amen. 55 years after I first read what Kaplan wrote, I had occasion to leaf through my copy. I found that the ideas in the paragraphs I had underlined prefigured those which sounded through many of my own utterances later in life." So there it is, this aha moment. So many people had it in reaction to the publication of Judaism as a Civilization, or when they stumbled on it, even as many others virulently rejected it. I want to, rather than proving that, I want to just take it as an assumption that all of us gathered for this webinar take for granted that Kaplan's magnum opus was and remains very influential. But what is it? What was it about this book, and what is it now? I want to start with what it is not. Judaism as a Civilization is not a complete articulation of Reconstructionist thought. Lay leaders and academics alike incorrectly tend to amalgamate the bulk of Kaplan's midlife corpus into his first of many books and presume that the entirety of his thinking was laid out there. Few examples. There is in Judaism as a Civilization no mention of peoplehood. The concept is implied. Kaplan used the term nationhood. Peoplehood was brought to speech in 1942 by a group of Reconstructionist leaders, including Kaplan, wrestling with the limitations of what they were able to accomplish with the concept of civilization. And for more, if you're interested in more about my thoughts on Kaplan's larger aspirations around both civilization and peoplehood, I'll refer you to an article I published titled "On Civilization and Culture, Reading Mordecai Kaplan Through the Lens of Eliezer Schweid." The editors have kindly allowed me to share both my original essay that I wrote in English and the published version, which was translated into Hebrew, and you can find them on the Kaplan Center website. So no peoplehood. Also, Judaism as a Civilization was not a complete discussion of Reconstructionist theology. It was addressed, especially in one chapter, the folk aspect of the Jewish religion, which is where Kaplan lays out folkways in place of mitzvot. We would probably translate that as minhagim in place of mitzvot. The folk theology was presented in his third book, published in 1937, The Meaning of God in Modern Jewish Religion. There is no mention of rejecting chosenness in Judaism as a Civilization. This was enacted in the 1945 Reconstructionist prayer book. It was justified in the introduction to that prayer book, and it was theorized more fully in a really cogent and powerful essay in The Future of the American Jew, published in 1948. And there is no mention of the terms Reconstructionism or Reconstructionist, nor is there the full definition as we come to think of it as Reconstructionism as the evolving religious civilization of the Jewish people. The religious piece found its way into the definition as when the journal, the Reconstructionist, was launched 6 months after the publication of Judaism as a Civilization. It was added in response to criticism that what Kaplan was doing was laying out humanistic Judaism. And the people at the end got added, began to show up in the early 1940s, around the same time as peoplehood emerged for the same reasons. So if it's not those things, what is it? Why did it matter then? And why does it matter now? At its most basic, what this book lays out is a definition, a metaphor, a rhetorical device designed to shift perspective, to empower people, designed to create the kind of aha moment that Klutznick described, and to prompt them to live lives, Jewish lives, American lives, of meaning and connection and service. It's designed to help them achieve what Kaplan might have called modern day salvation. It's designed to help Jews and Judaism flourish in modernity. So beyond the rhetorical device, Judaism as a civilization, the full scope of it was many, many, many things. If the terms Reconstructionism or Reconstructionist don't appear, the word status appears 108 times in the text. Status was a huge preoccupation of Mordecai Kaplan's. The onset of modernity was tremendously disruptive to Jews and to Jewish life. One reason was because there was a political shift from corporate identity, from understanding us as a collective, to understanding Jews as individual citizens of a nation state. What that means is that for the first time, Judaism and Jewishness were severed. And Kaplan sought to reintegrate them, and in this way help modern Jews come to a new understanding of the status of Jews. And the book also sought to address the other major disruption of modernity, rationalism. In 1909, Kaplan shared his Copernican revolution, and I'm quoting here from the Introduction of Judaism as a Civilization, the thesis that the future of Judaism demanded that all Jewish teaching and practical activity be based on the proposition that the Jewish religion existed for the Jewish people, and not the Jewish people for the Jewish religion. Together with the political shift, rationalism shattered Jewish religious and communal authority. And Kaplan was constructively responding to this shattering with his revolution. Judaism as a Civilization was an effort to articulate the implications of his revolution using the tools of contemporary social science. Judaism as a Civilization was about how to be Jewish in America. He was speaking to the children of the waves of immigrant from Eastern Europe, and he was trying to communicate to them that you didn't have to choose between being Jewish and being American. He was putting forward that the way to be a good American was to be a good Jew. He drew heavily from influences in the American environment, advocating for the incorporation of democracy into Jewish life, including the religious life, and applying the principles of pragmatism. We get the term Reconstruction from John Dewey, though this origin is really masked to most people. In addition to drawing from the American environment, Kaplan was also seeking to influence the American environment. He was working forcefully against a homogenizing, melting pot theory. He was working alongside a compatriot, Horace Kallen, who was putting forward the idea of cultural pluralism. And another way he hoped to influence the American society was to empower Jews to help safeguard American democracy. He understood the book that he was writing to be expressive of an ideology that he hoped would be an alternative to communism and socialism, especially how they were appealing to young people. And he also preferred ideology to institutions because he saw that institutions were too often wasteful or redundant or competitive. This book is a lot about Zionism. Kaplan was vastly inspired by the sweep and the impact of Zionism. It was a baby idea in 1897, and by the time he was writing it, it was very, very influential around the world and on the American Jewish scene. And this book was an effort to disseminate and influence and rehabilitate Zionism. He wanted to disseminate Zionism to an American Jewish community that was still ambivalent or confused about it. He wanted to influence the Zionist movement in his promotion of cultural Zionism over political Zionism that focused on establishing a Jewish state. And he wanted to rehabilitate it. His greatest influence, by his own acknowledgement, was Achad Ha'am, who, in his articulation of spiritual Zionism, rejected all religious expressions and religious sources. Kaplan thought this decision cut Jews off from rich and nourishing well springs, and in articulating Reconstructionism, believed that he was correcting this error. Judaism as a civilization was about legitimating multiple ways of being Jewish. If one consequence of modernity was the shattering of religious and communal authority, Kaplan adamantly opposed any individual, any organization that asserted authority and that presumed to define exclusively who was a good Jew or what was the right or sole way to be Jewish. He spoke endlessly about diversity, insisting that the Jewish civilization could be strengthened by the heterogeneity of thought and practice, and that we could find unity in diversity. One of his goals was to make religion more relevant to modern Jews through reconstruction and harmonization with rationalism. And even as religion was so centrally important to him, another was to make space for, even celebrate, Jews who were positively identified but not religious. He was building out what we might call extra-religious categories, which anticipated the emergence of ethnicity a few years later. We tend to think of ethnicity as immutable. It did not emerge as an analytical or descriptive category until 1941. He was helping to flesh out that idea. And there was a racial component as well. In the wake of the hardening of the color line after the Plessy versus Ferguson decision in 1896, the language of race that sometimes described that extra-religious stuff, Young Men's Hebrew Association, no longer worked so well for the Jewish community. And Kaplan's focus on civilization oriented communal conversation away from race and toward a different conceptualization of Jewish distinctiveness. More than anything, Judaism as a civilization was an effort to inspire creativity and activism and empowerment. Kaplan wrote in his preface to the publication in 1933, "Spiritual stagnation in America must be disturbed, and if some of the views expressed in this book will produce the slightest ripple in American Jewish thinking, this book will have served a useful purpose." Activism was the fullest realization of his Copernican revolution. Kaplan insisted that by using the tools of social science, Judaism could be consciously altered to promote the survival of the Jewish people. So I'll talk first about the book's reception and the period when it was most influential, which was from its publication in 1934 to the years immediately following World War II. Judaism as a civilization was widely reviewed or remarked upon in those first few years after its publication. Those of you who are on early saw that the first run was sold out very quickly. Kaplan bought all those copies so that he could ask people to buy them on his tours. There were many, mostly positive reviews in the non-Orthodox Jewish press and even in the secular press, including reviews in The Nation and the New York Times. He very much wanted that last and was very pleased. There were attacks from expected quarters. For sure, Orthodox newspaper, they focused mostly on the folkways chapter and on the implications of the naturalist theology that it suggested. There were attacks from classical Reform rabbis around the implications of civilization. The Reform rabbinate was getting ready to prepare what came to be known as the Columbus Platform. It was approaching the 50th anniversary of the Pittsburgh Platform. And at the 1935 CCAR convention, the Rabbinic Convention, participants were reviewing materials and they were looking at God, Torah, and Israel. And in the Israel discussions, the classical Reform rabbis had many, many strong critiques of civilization. That said, it's important to note that Kaplan had many adherents and appreciators within the reform movement, so much so that his thought very much deeply influenced what they ultimately produced in the Columbus Platform in 1937. I'll just very quickly mention the weirdest attack, the most unexpected attack, which was a series of 2 editorials by the editor of Christianity Today. The language was fueled by nativism. It was perceived as threatening by many people. He claimed that Judaism as a civilization was a rejection of American civilization, one that called for a radical separate nation in America. And there was much backlash in response to his attack from rabbis who didn't agree with Kaplan, much like the Cherem 10 years later when the prayer book was burned, and also from many prominent Christians. Within the conservative movement that Kaplan was most closely identified, the opinion was divided. For sure, Kaplan always had many Hasidim among the rabbis, many appreciators among lay people, and not so much among his peers and superiors on the faculty of the Jewish Theological Seminary. One of the attacks in the Orthodox press was penned by Chancellor Cyrus Adler, and not yet Chancellor Louis Finkelstein gave a keynote address on the occasion of JTS's 50th anniversary, and he laid out a vision that explicitly repudiated most of Kaplan's analysis. Beyond these reviews, there was very immediate impact. The publication cemented Kaplan's reputation nationally. He was already very well known, most especially in New York, and this really launched him nationally. It unblocked his pen, where it was his first in his mid-50s. After that, he wrote several more books, and there were also other disciples who put forward what Reconstructionism was and its implications. This approach, as the Kletsnik anecdote suggests, was vastly appealing to some lay people and really inspired them in their own work. That said, it required explication. It required interpretation. Ira Eisenstein published Creative Judaism as a shortened and simplified version of the book in response to requests for it. And also, we needed explication on how to apply this amazing methodology, this amazing approach that was laid out in the book, which led to the founding of the journal, The Reconstructionist, 6 months after the book's publication by a small group of devoted disciples, explaining how to bring it to life. The magazine, which was put out 20 times a year, every other week, over 10 months, had a small but influential base, including many intellectuals and communal leaders. It was published by the Society for the Advancement of Judaism for the first 5 years, and then taken over by the nascent Jewish Reconstructionist Foundation, which was established in 1940 to issue publications and other works of Jewish creativity. And the foundation followed Kaplan's preferred strategy of advancing Reconstructionism as an ideology, as a school of thought. So it put out rhetorical argumentation. Many of the books that he wrote or others, other Reconstructionist ideologues wrote. The magazine, they had a whole very extensive pamphlet series. They put out powerful, influential liturgy, the New Haggadah, in 1941, which spawned the plethora of Haggadot we see today, the prayer book in 1945, and a handful of instances of creativity. My favorite is the Judith Kaplan Eisenstein and Iris Eisenstein's first cantata, What is Torah?, which was put out in 1943. It was a big hit across the Jewish landscape, and they published several others. So that's the period when the book came out, had a significant influence, and at least some of what it brought to life. The next phase, from the late 1940s to the late 1960s, I would say, a lot was happening, but it was a mixed bag. Kaplan remained revered as a public figure. Every 5 years, the foundation would put a big birthday celebration, and the room was packed, and generous contributions were made in his honor. The book itself declined in influence, and the foundation's key strategies began to change. By the late 1940s, the foundation, the ideologues who were associated with it, they were increasingly trying to find ways to turn the very elite message of Reconstructionism into a mass movement. As I tried to show, it had significant impact, but it was nowhere near what they wanted. And some of that had to do with circumstances, and some of that had to do with unforced errors. A little bit about Kaplan. He was a pungent critic who offered a comprehensive, elite, and theoretical critique. He held back from offering up prescriptions for particular programs because he thought it would necessarily limit others' creativity and narrow the potential breadth and depth of a reconstructed, organic Jewish community. And when he did put them forward, he was quite utopianist and maximalist in his proposals for implementation, very hard to bring to life. Some of the strategies that the foundation used were very personally fulfilling to individuals, but they were ephemeral. There were many study groups, but eventually they came to an end. People reported that preparing for and performing the cantatas that the foundation put out, they were thrilling experiences, but then they were over and people went back to their ordinary lives. There's the widespread observation that the sociology of a Reconstructionist approach was very, very appealing to many Jews, and the theology less so. And the folks at the foundation talked about that there existed a general program for the broader Jewish community and a partial program for the real Verbrennte Reconstructionists who were interested in all things, including the theology. And there was, of course, the long-standing tension between Kaplan and at least some of his disciples about whether to keep Reconstructionism as a school of thought, in his words, a movement in but not of Judaism, or whether to establish a denomination and to build out organizations and structures to demonstrate Reconstructionism. Whatever your opinion on the matter, the delay between the publication of the Judaism as a Civilization and the attention and the influence it had, and the emergence of denominational structures, a congregational union began to be established in 1954. The Reconstructionist Rabbinical College was established in 1968. That gap of time had a lasting impact on the degree of influence that they could exercise. And another challenge to the school of thought was that, think about those birthday celebrations I just meant, folks could consider Kaplan their mentor and yet remain loyal to their existing institutions. Perhaps bringing Reconstructionism into them, but not in a way that was necessarily explicit or abiding. Even as Kaplan wrote extensively in the years following 1934, his later books were less influential, and he chose never to revise Judaism as a Civilization. He writes about this in an introduction to the 1957 publication, reissued. The first two were from Macmillan, the second two by the Jewish Reconstructionist Foundation. And he said that in the late 1930s, there was a call for a third printing. He was living in Israel at the time, in Palestine at the time, teaching at the Hebrew University. And he offers up these reasons why he advised against it at that time. He was keenly aware that his analysis of American Jewish life contained in the first edition, which was completed in the late 1920s, was already outdated. He knew he would have to revise the Reform chapter in light of the Columbus platform. There was also the matter of peoplehood and Zionism. He said the concept of nationhood as it applied to Jews had come to be closely identified with statehood. And so he'd have to rework a whole bunch around the concept of peoplehood. By that point, he was already much further along in giving up chosenness. And so he'd need to rework those sections. So he didn't want to just reissue it. He intended to rewrite it. And he found himself that he was too busy. But the fact that the 1957 edition was reissued by the foundation, it was because it was out of print and hard to find, and it is an indication of how it had faded in influence. Kaplan in a certain way really captured the zeitgeist of the interwar period, and he and his thought were out of step with trends in the post-war period. The optimism of the progressive era had been shattered by both the hot and the Cold War. In the aftermath of the Holocaust and Hiroshima, there was mistrust of Enlightenment thought. There were questions about the limits of human agency. There was a theological turn to the transcendent. At that moment in time, there was a diminishment of anti-Semitism that opened previously closed doors for American Jews. And those descendants of East European Jews moved out of the dense ethnic enclaves to the suburbs, which inaugurated a profound shift in the nature of collective identity. What it looked like in the 50s and the 60s was quite different from what it looked like when Kaplan was putting together what became Judaism as a civilization. So this trajectory of not disappearing, but of fading influence continued into the 60s. We learn from Riv Ellen Prell how the Jewish counterculture gave rise to the Chavurah movement, and feminist Judaism was made possible by Kaplan's commitment to diversity and inclusion and experimentation, but they would not or even could not acknowledge him. Kaplan's project was to integrate Jews into American society. And the shift that happened, especially in the late 1960s, after the emergence of Black Power, after the Jewish reawakening following the Six-Day War, in light of all the critiques of mainstream American society that were prevalent in the 60s, young Jews wanted to use their Jewishness to separate from American society. So they rejected pioneers like Kaplan. They couldn't see what he contributed, even though they benefited from his work. The exceptions were perhaps the first students at RRC, opened in 1968, some of whom came because they were ideological Reconstructionists, some perhaps for a draft deferment. The banishment by JTS following his retirement, Kaplan's retirement after more than 50 years in 1963, and following the founding of RRC in 1968 didn't help. It's a strong term, banishment. It was certainly not official. It was always an uncomfortable relationship, and Kaplan was always a gadfly, much more embraced by United Synagogue and lay people, but not by the more powerful JTS. And there was the changing nature of American Jewish society and American Jews' clear preference for symbolic ethnicity rather than the deep, substantive, activist version that Kaplan and his circle were trying to seed. So I'm going to start to wind down. I'm turning to the resurgence of Kaplan's ideas, of institutions growing out of them, of the book itself, Judaism as a Civilization. I'm so grateful to Mel in his introduction to the 2010 edition. There were two more editions in 1981 in preparations for Kaplan's centennial. JPS published an edition, and then again in 2010. In his introduction, Mel lists the Reconstructionist institutions that have grown up in this same period that I'm tracing. And to this day, the small but mighty Reconstructionist movement was organized institutionally. And as Mel said, I'm honored to serve as the head of its central organization, Reconstructing Judaism. And it's been 10 years. And as the combination of the Rabbinical College and the Congregational Union and the locus for demonstrating a Reconstructionist approach through offerings like Ritual Well is not really a denomination and aims to be much more. A lot of the Jewish world has caught up to Kaplan in his critique and in his broad-scale prescriptions. I have to share with you that Kaplan hated this assertion. In the preface to the 1967 edition, the second one that the Foundation published, he writes, "Telling its author that he is ahead of his time is likely to serve his contemporaries as an excuse for not taking him seriously." But as Arnie Eisen writes in the review essay that appears at the beginning of the 2010 edition, Kaplan was right at nearly every juncture. And Arnie has done a tremendous amount to rehabilitate Kaplan in his scholarship, and when he became the chancellor of the seminary, really reintroduced Kaplan in a very powerful way. And in terms of scholarship, I also really want to recognize Deborah Moore for her consistent treatment of the Reconstructionist movement in her historical work. It is impossible to understate the influence of Judaism Faces the 20th Century, a biography of Mordecai Kaplan by Mel Skelt, and the publication of the diaries by Mel and by Dr. Eric Kaplan. There is ever-growing interest in Kaplan, and one of the current rabbinical students announced that they came to RRC because of Judaism as a Civilization. And I want to note also that Kaplan is very well known and widely read among Israeli intellectuals and educators because the concept of civilization resonates so powerfully with that locus of primary Jewish civilization. So where I want to conclude, so many of the challenges of modernity that Kaplan was seeking to address with Judaism as a civilization, they remain with us today. And one reason I think that Judaism as a civilization remains relevant is because it is so comprehensive and his critique is so trenchant that everyone can find something that is still useful today. I'll raise up one, for example, one that I think is most compelling. Kaplan talked about it briefly here and developed it with his disciples further, the idea that it should be organic community as the primary mediator for Jews to be organizationally Jewish rather than the synagogue. And we saw that in the years following World War II, when Jews spread out to the suburbs, the conservative movement was ascendant as they established many, many synagogues. The sociologist Marshall Sclair suggests that they functioned as ethnic churches. Kaplan always preferred organic community out of the recognition that there were different ways to being Jewish. And in this, he anticipated the post-congregational moment we find ourselves in now, and he tried to create conditions for a different kind of flourishing. There's all the challenges of modernity and many more challenges of post-modernity that Kaplan never could have anticipated. I don't think he could have really I'm not certain we've gotten our minds around the digital age, the impact of social media, and God help us around AI. I'll just focus in about postmodernity and ethnicity. With Judaism as a civilization and later Reconstructionist thinking, the Reconstructionist movement was in the vanguard around conceptualizing ethnicity, we are now facing what it means to be living in a post-ethnic moment. The boundaries are so much more porous than Kaplan or Callan ever could have imagined, and the possibility of identities are so much more multiple. The scholar David Hollinger observes that the challenge to members of communities of descent, like ethnic communities like the Jews, in the face of this reality is to find ways to renew our communities so that our children, so that the next generation might choose to devote their energies to them even after experiencing opportunities for affiliating with other groups and with other types of people. Ira Eisenstein used to explain Reconstructionism through the 3 B's, belonging. We can, in shorthand, talk about peoplehood, believing, and behaving. And with behaving, he was mostly thinking about halachic observance. And he would frequently say that belonging precedes behaving. This was very much reflective of Kaplan's orientation toward the collective and of the ethnic moment. I suggest that in this post-ethnic moment, belonging, it has at once fragmented and is often a contentless affirmation of symbolic ethnicity. The Pew study asks, are you proud to be a Jewish people, be part of the Jewish people? And people say yes. And that might be the full extent. And that behaving, not in a non-halachic way, in a way imbued with the creativity that Kaplan called for, is incredibly important at this moment as we try to make the case for why belong. There's also just the changing sociology in light of all of the tremendous acceptance of Jews, all of those open boundaries where Kaplan sought to Americanize Jews. We need to now Judaize American Jews. And at the same time, with the rise of radical individualism and the epidemic of crushing loneliness, making the case for belonging is crucially important, but it is making the case for community, not simply asserting. And I think more and more it is about local community, ones that make, as Kaplan would have advised, ample space for individuals and the willingness to be changed as those individuals enter in. I want to reflect my last 2 comments that there are things that are newly relevant that I might not have written when Jeffrey asked me to give this keynote back in May. I may have, but they feel very acute now. Kaplan wrote in the interwar period. They didn't know World War II was going to happen, but we now look back at that time and see that it was an interwar period. And where I have lived my life understanding myself to be living in the post-World War II period, those norms have disappeared. And it feels clearer and clearer that we, too, are living in an in-between time. And we see some of the things, as I said, that Kaplan couldn't have anticipated, like AI and whether or not there are any limits. We also see some of the things that he and his community struggled with. Rising anti-Semitism. And indeed, the Reconstructionist response today is not at all dissimilar. It's actually largely the same as the response that Kaplan gave, that the best response is about generative Jewish life. It cannot simply be about defensiveness. We see the need to safeguard American democracy, and I'm very grateful to A More Perfect Union, an organization that's been recently founded, dedicated to that. I think so often of Kaplan's decision to set aside chosenness in the face of rising chauvinism around the world, and it's in the current government of Israel, before and during this war, with many members who are promoting, I can't even believe these words are coming out of my mouth, a Jewish supremacist vision, which would have been appalling to him. And there are abiding questions about what Kaplan Zionism would look like in this world at this time, and what progressive Zionism or Reconstructionism Zionism even is and needs to be. I'll end with this observation that I think the most powerful thing we can take from Judaism as a civilization and from the life that Kaplan lived is how he was a model of how to be in the world. The diaries show that Kaplan was racked with guilt sometimes or insecurity. He was sometimes pessimistic, but the public Kaplan put forward an intentional optimism in the Jewish people, in humanity, in our agency, in our capacity to evoke godliness. With that came that unrelenting forthrightness in the willingness to address the challenges that we face. And this was an anticipation of postmodernity. He was a bricoleur. He was willing to grab onto any tool, any resource that would help him in addressing these challenges. And the last thing I want to say is, and not just challenges, but the generativity. Kaplan is an incredibly important model of how to live the world with a commitment to creative and complete engagement.
Deborah Waxman, thank you as always for a very thoughtful set of reflections. We're going to turn now to Dr. Elias Sachs for some additional thoughts in response to Deborah's presentation, and he certainly has, as a scholar, thoughts of his own. Just a quick heads up to both Deborah and Elias. We will now segue, after your comments, Elias, any dialogue that we might have between you into the more general response to sets of questions that are coming from the group. Elias, without any further ado, please.
Well, first of all, just thank you, Deborah, for that wonderful, incredibly rich talk. And thank you, of course, Jeffrey, Mel, Stephen, and the Kaplan Center, and all of you for partnering with us at the Jewish Publication Society on today's program. Since 1888, JPS has had the honor of being the home of many works that have shaped the landscape of Jewish life. And Judaism as a civilization has to stand toward the top of any list of such texts. So my charge this afternoon is to respond to Deborah's rich, provocative talk. And I have to admit, it's a little daunting to try to do so because she's given us so much that we could be discussing. Judaism as a civilization in its original context. Judaism as a civilization as it's been received over the past 90 years. Judaism as a civilization as it figured in Kaplan's own intellectual development. We don't have time to think about all of these points in my response. So for the sake of time, I just want to take up the question that Deborah left us with at the end of her remarks. The question of what Judaism as a civilization might offer us today, what it means to think of this book, to use the language of our webinar, as a gift that keeps on giving. Now, on the one hand, as Deborah noted, this book is very much a product of its own time. And there are, I think, real questions about whether and how it speaks to concerns that animate Jewish life today. At the same time, on the other hand, as she also noted, there do seem to be ways in which this book continues to be profoundly timely. So what I want to do is riff a little bit on the points raised by Deborah and explore two ways in which Judaism as a civilization might speak to us today. In particular, I'd like to think about what Judaism as a civilization might offer us when thinking about the relevance of Jewish life today, and what Judaism as a civilization might offer us when thinking about the diversity of Jewish life today. Okay, so let me begin with relevance. As Deborah noted at the end of her remarks, one of the real kind of striking elements of this book, of Kaplan's thought more broadly, was his commitment to what Deborah called forthrightness, to acknowledging and addressing the challenges facing contemporary Jews. And in fact, if we look at the text of Judaism as a civilization, we find that one of its chief critiques of existing versions of Judaism is that they had little or nothing to offer when it came to those challenges. As many of you, I'm sure, know, early on in the text, Judaism as a civilization offers an extended critique of what it calls the reformist and neo-Orthodox versions of Judaism, along with their variants. And while Kaplan is troubled by the fact that all of these versions of Judaism conceive of Judaism primarily as a religion, and while he has a number of specific critiques about the details of these religiously inflected visions of Judaism, he actually has a more overarching concern as well. And I'm actually going to share my screen now so we can see that concern together. So this is what Kaplan says. He says, "We have noted the shortcomings of all those versions of Judaism, all the ones he's surveyed, when analyzed from the standpoint of what they actually teach. But their most conspicuous failure is in what they omit to teach. Their inadequacy is such that they have nothing to contribute to vast areas of Jewish life which are in need of planning and direction." This next bit is in italics in the original. "The most vital issues which confront the Jews today do not even figure in the theoretic background of neo-Orthodoxy, Reformism, and their variants. How is it that each of the outstanding groups in Jewish life could have so misconceived the problem of Jewish adjustment as to omit from its conception of Judaism principles that would guide the Jew in meeting some of his most pressing needs?" And so for Kaplan, the problem with other versions of Judaism is not simply that they misunderstand or misdescribe Judaism, it's that they do so in a manner that renders them unable to provide guidance when it comes to the issues that matter most to contemporary Jews. And in particular, he goes on to say, those other visions of Judaism provide no substantive guidance when it comes to Zionism, when it comes to Jewish ideological and practical diversity, when it comes to anti-Semitism, when it comes to the structure of Jewish communal life, and when it comes to Jewish education. Now, I don't know that that list exhausts the most vital issues which confront Jews in 2023, although I think there's a tremendous amount of resonance. Nevertheless, what I want to suggest is that we find in this passage might be one of the gifts that Judaism as a civilization offers us today, a criterion, albeit not the only one, with which to assess our own visions of Judaism. Right? On this view, a vision of Judaism is worth endorsing only if it enables us to address the most difficult challenges facing contemporary Jews. Right? It's not enough that our understanding of Judaism be compatible with the world we inhabit. It's not enough that our understanding of Judaism provide us with meaning or comfort in the world that we inhabit. Our vision of Judaism actually has to speak to the challenges emerging from and shaping that world, right? Rather than providing refuge or respite from the most pressing issues at the heart of contemporary life, on this Kaplanian account, our vision of Judaism actually has to empower us to confront those issues head on. Now, of course, we might identify the pressing issues that face us today as extending well beyond those named by Kaplan. Perhaps we need a theory of Jewish life that wrestles with questions of race and with the complicated relationship between many Jewish communities on the one hand and white supremacy and white privilege on the other. Perhaps we need a version of Jewish life that engages questions about gender and sexuality. Perhaps we need a version of Jewish life that provides guidance about when we should bring religious texts into public policy debates. Perhaps we need a version of Jewish life that provides us with tools to think about political action in our democracy, and especially about when and how we form coalitions with groups with whom we might not agree on everything. and in fact with whom we might disagree strongly on quite a bit. Perhaps we need visions of Judaism that have something to say about military ethics and just war theory and the exercise of power. However we identify the questions that need to be addressed, though, it seems to me that this might be one thing that Kaplan offers us, a criterion, again, not the only one, but a criterion for assessing visions of Judaism. I wonder whether what Judaism as a civilization does is remind us that we should always be asking the following question. Do we have a version of Judaism that's sufficiently relevant? Do we have a version of Judaism that speaks to today's most difficult issues? What's the range of questions that contemporary Jewish communities face? And do we have a theory of Judaism that actually has something useful to say about them? Do we have a version of Judaism that addresses the most urgent and troubling questions of the day? Or are we at risk of treating Judaism more as a relief from exploring big questions than as an impetus to do so? So that's one kind of gift that I think Judaism as a civilization gives. But I think it offers a second gift as well, relating not just to the relevance of Jewish life, but to the diversity of Jewish life. As Deborah noted, and here I'm going to quote her talk, Kaplan spoke endlessly about diversity, insisting that Jewish civilization could be strengthened by heterogeneity of thought and practice. And in fact, I would add that for Kaplan, it's not simply that Judaism construed as a civilization would be strengthened by diversity in Jewish life. It's also that Judaism construed as a civilization would be particularly hospitable to diversity in Jewish life. So again, I want to just share one passage from Judaism as a civilization. So Kaplan writes, the immediate need is for some conception of Judaism broad enough to include within its scope all who want to remain Jews, whatever the reason or motive be. That's not merely an academic need, but a practical one. Some basis of creative unity among Jews has to be found that will not require anyone to surrender his convictions or to do violence to his conscience. Such a basis, it would seem, can be found in the conception of Judaism as a civilization, because that conception allows for diversity of belief and practice, for all forms of socially useful activity and all types of group associations. So there's a lot going on here in this passage, but part of what Kaplan is getting at is the idea that a civilization is naturally, inherently, an internally diverse entity, encompassing a broad range of beliefs, practices, and communal structures. Right? So conceiving of Judaism as a civilization then helps us see internal Jewish diversity not as a problem to be solved or an aberration to be explained, but as a result to be expected and accepted. Right? For Kaplan, whereas a religious conception of Judaism runs the risk of being inherently sectarian, right, inviting us to distinguish correct and incorrect beliefs and practices, a civilizational conception of Judaism is inherently capacious, encompassing, as Kaplan would put it, the diverse types of historical experiences, social organization, folk sanctions, standards of conduct, social, spiritual ideals, and aesthetic values, which in their totality form a civilization. Now, when Kaplan was talking about diversity, he had particular issues in mind, the diversity of religious outlooks within Judaism, for example, or the diversity of communal structures that would be needed by Jews living in different political contexts in different parts of the globe. Nevertheless, I wonder whether, intentionally or not, Kaplan is providing us with another criterion here for assessing visions of Jewish life we have today, a criterion which insists that a version of Judaism is worth endorsing only if it helps us live alongside forms of Jewish belief, practice, and communal governance and structure radically different from our own. Right? It's not enough, in other words, that our version of Judaism fit with our own particular circumstances. It's also that our version of Judaism, our vision of Judaism, our theories of Judaism should allow us to recognize and accept that other forms of Judaism might actually fit better with the circumstances of other individuals and groups. Now, again, what this means concretely is going to be complicated, right? We might think that we need to go beyond Kaplan and broaden the kinds of diversity to be accommodated and empowered and celebrated in contemporary Jewish life. Perhaps we need to ensure that our visions of Judaism don't marginalize forms of Jewish life with roots in other sorts of backgrounds and experiences. Those of us who come from Ashkenazi backgrounds need to make sure that we're not marginalizing practices and modes of communal life with roots in Sephardi and Mizrahi communities. Those of us who come from groups classified as white in American society need to make sure that we're not closing off Jewish communal life to those who identify as Jews of color. Those of us who find a home in the norms and practices of 21st century American democracy might need to ask how we can recognize forms of Judaism tailored to versions of democracy different from our own. Perhaps we need to build communal organizations with as few requirements as possible when it comes to ideological commitments. Maybe we need to broaden the boundaries of acceptable Jewish religious or political discourse. And we might also need to wonder whether there are limits to the diversity that Jewish life should encourage. If for Kaplan, thinking of Judaism as a civilization allows for all forms of socially useful activity, are there forms of activity that are not socially useful? Are there forms of Jewish life that are beyond the pale? And if so, what do we do about that? Are there forms of Jewish life that might be socially useful in some settings, but not in others? Say, in American democracy, but not in Israeli democracy, or vice versa? And what follows from that? However we kind of resolve these issues, though, it seems to me that this might be another gift that Kaplan offers us, another criterion for assessing Jewish life. But I wonder whether what Judaism as a civilization does is also to remind us that we should always be asking the following question: do we have a version of Judaism that's sufficiently hospitable to diversity? Do we have a vision of Judaism that empowers us and requires us to exist alongside forms of Jewish life different from our own? What's the full range of options that are acceptable when it comes to Jewish belief and practice and communal structure? And does our vision of Jewish life call on us and empower us to accommodate them? I don't pretend to have answers to any of these questions, but I think part of why Judaism as a civilization is such a gift is that it forces us to ask them. And so I'll just conclude by again expressing my gratitude for this gift and to Deborah's words for opening it up to us today.
So you're back with Dr. Jeffrey Schein, the Executive Director of the Kaplan Center. And I have to tell folks that I got a couple emails saying, what kind of question could I ask? This is so profound. There's so much richness and complexity. But after 3 years of facilitating webinars for the Kaplan Center, I have enormous confidence that we always come up with a good question that will continue to stretch these wonderful presentations. And I'm going to turn it over to my friend and colleague, Dr. Eric Kaplan, to frame a couple of these questions drawn from the chat room. Eric, it's all yours.
Thank you. So there's questions coming in even as I put them together to ask. So I'll ask to start off, the ones that have, the kind of the focus of the ones that have come in up till now. So I guess not surprisingly, considering the moment that we're living in, a lot of the questions are focused on the whole issue of Israel and Zionism. So I've kind of put three things that from the chat, I'm putting them together, and I think there's a lot going on here, so it will keep you guys busy for sure. The first is if you could say more about Kaplan's definition of Zionism, the uniqueness of his definition of Zionism, and its relation to Ahad Ha'am's conception of cultural Zionism. The next after that is how might Kaplan have approached the growing anti-Zionism in the Jewish and Reconstructionist worlds, or at least non-Zionism? That's kind of me editing in brackets that. And what have the last 2 months of of life for Jewish people, not only in the land of Israel, but outside it. What do you think the impact of that has been on the concepts of behaving and belonging, right? I guess this grows specifically out of the points that were made about the difference between our, the post Judaism as a civilization moment in terms of ethnicity and the current moment. So I'll stop there for now.
Ellie, you let me know what you might want to. I mean, I can speak to all of them or some of them. How do you want to?
Why don't you speak to as many of them as you would like to speak to, and I'll sort of jump in after that and continue my practice of shamelessly riffing on what you have to say.
All right, so I'll try to speak briefly. I'll start with the last. In terms of the last couple of months, I'm keenly aware that we're living through a seismic shift, and we don't know what it is fully, and it changes every day. And that's hard and intense. So I don't know. The answer is I don't know. Because alongside, the last 2 months, I think we can be talking about the conflict in Israel, like October 7th, and then the response to Gaza, and also shifting, what's going on vis-a-vis anti-Semitism here in the States and around the world. What is fascinating to me is that rabbis in our congregations are reporting like record number of people who are interested in converting to Judaism. People who have been living as in Jewish homes and active in synagogues, and sometimes folks who haven't, who are interested in affirming their Jewish identification. Stephen, I don't know if you can speak to this, but I saw your successor, Rabbi Amy Bernstein, gave a quote to the Jewish journals remarking on this, and I've heard it from other Reconstructionist rabbis as well. So to be determined, as I said, I think the Reconstructionist response to anti-Semitism has been consistent from Kaplan's day to ours. I wrote a major talk on Beyond Anti-Semitism, which is about leaning into the generativity and to the Jewishness. And we're also hearing that people are coming, they're showing up at shul and they're looking, I think, seeking community. So that's really, really interesting. I think I'll just I won't expand that much on. Well, I'll kind of try to answer the first two questions briefly as one. Ahad Ha'am put forward spiritual Zionism and thought that there should be a central yishuv, like a very vibrant Jewish presence in Israel, but was not a fan of political Zionism. It was more theoretical in his day than it was in Kaplan's day. And as I said, Kaplan's major correction was to reinsert the access in a reconstructed way to the breadth of Jewish sources, of Jewish wisdom, of Jewish practice to support Judaism and certainly Zionism. And after Ahad Ha'am, he was not a huge fan of political Zionism. Noam Pienko has an amazing book called Zionism and the Roads Not Taken, and he treats Kaplan's ambivalence about this. In that, the Future of American Jew was published in 1948, and Kaplan writes that he strongly preferred a commonwealth, and with the nascent United Nations having some involvement there. And his work following the establishment of the state and the prevailing the victory of a political vision and Ben-Gurion's orientation toward Aliyah was to argue forcefully that now that the political goal had been achieved, that the mission of the Zionist movement writ large and the Zionist institutions should be about promoting worldwide Jewish peoplehood. And I think that when he kind of lost that argument in both in the American and at a conference at the World Zionist Organization, that is one of the reasons why his opposition to the emergence of denominational structures started to fade. He was concerned about minority rights. He was mostly concerned about the kind of Jewish supremacism we're seeing today, about state-powered religious authority married to state power. and what it would mean for the kind of diversity that Ellie and I both spoke about. He was concerned about minority rights, but he wasn't, for example, part of like Brit Shalom, which was much more of an advocate toward Arab rights. I don't think they would have used the term Palestinian. I think that there is this, given his concerns about authoritarianism, and given his, and he thought that the establishment of the State of Israel was incredibly important. So I like what Kaplan would say now, I think it's very hard to, for me to, I don't want to approach it through the lens of Kaplan. I want to approach it beginning with Kaplan and try to trace the evolution. I think that vis-a-vis certain trends that are emerging, young people beyond and within the Reconstructionist movement who raise serious concerns about how Zionism has been brought to life under the leadership of Benjamin Netanyahu over these last 25, 30 years. I think that he would promote worldwide Jewish peoplehood incredibly powerfully, and he would also resonate with some of the critiques of abuse of power, of a distortion of what it means to be the kind of ner that Stephen spoke about in his Devar Torah. I'll stop so that there's an opportunity for Elias to build on.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm not sure that I have so much to add. I agree entirely with the idea that I'm not sure I can speak to what Kaplan himself would have said, but sort of kind of in a mood of Kaplanian experimentation, I'll try to sort of think about what some ideas in a book like Judaism as a Civilization might point us to. And as the question was being asked, and as Deborah was giving her response, sort of two kinds of thoughts or questions kept going through my head. One has to do with concepts and categories. So, the moment where Kaplan introduces the concept of civilization in Judaism as a civilization is a really interesting one. It's framed as a moment where Kaplan says, look, one of our real problems today is that we don't have all of the categories that we've used to think about Judaism up to this point don't work. They might have been effective at particular moments to help Judaism be intelligible to certain non-Jewish audiences, but they're not particularly useful when thinking among Jews. And maybe they're not even that useful when having conversations with the broader non-Jewish world. And that's then the kind of springboard for introducing civilization as the new category that we need. And, one of the things that for me has been so striking in recent weeks is a real sense that the world as a whole doesn't really have a good set of categories for making sense of Jews, the Jewish people, Zionism, Israel, whatever you think the right kind of political or ethical conclusions that should follow from whatever the right sort of categories would be. I think that many of the challenges that we're seeing and debates we're seeing and real pain we're seeing on college campuses and different communities have everything to do with the inadequacy of many of the concepts and categories with which American society thinks about Judaism. And so I think one kind of Kaplanian response to what we've seen in recent weeks is to sort of double down on the idea that categories and concepts and ideas matter. That we actually we need to engage in the difficult work internally and externally of recognizing how existing categories might illuminate some aspects of Jewish existence and obscure others. And we need to be willing to have the difficult conversations about saying, well, these concepts might get at some aspects of the reality of the State of Israel, but miss others. So again, I don't know concretely what follows from that. I haven't thought through what it means to use a concept like civilization at this particular moment. But I do think the kind of Kaplanian move of saying concepts and categories matter, and we need to engage in experimentation and formulation of concepts and categories, that really, I think, resonates a lot with what I'm seeing. So that's one thought I had. The other thought I had is Kaplan's celebration of different forms of Jewish creativity in Judaism as a civilization, and that language of socially useful activity. And, Kaplan has these moments where he kind of rails is too strong, expresses his displeasure with those who, he rails in some points, just a particular moment where I'm talking about now, I'm not sure it's railing, where he's sort of frustrated with people who have diminished the importance of Jewish art. And I wonder whether one other kind of Kaplanian response to the moment is to sort of say, are there forms of Jewish creativity, intellectual, political, that we've failed to cultivate, but that we now realize that we desperately need? I mentioned the possibility of a kind of Jewish ethics of power, a Jewish kind of just war theory. I used to teach a course called Religion, Ethics, and Politics. When I would teach the just war days, it's basically all Christian thinkers I would bring in. We don't have a great tradition of thinking about that in modern Judaism. It's a painful and challenging topic, but I think an important one. And again, I wonder whether this is another kind of Kaplanian response to encourage a kind of investment in forms of creativity, religious, intellectual, cultural, that maybe we haven't facilitated or encouraged before, whatever we think the content of that should be.
One more sentence, Eric, before you, is that one of my deep fear is that the organized Jewish communal response to everything that's going on will be investments in a very defensive kind of a response to anti-Semitism, rather than the incredibly generative vision that you just spoke about. I mean, if that Reconstructionist vision could prevail, so much richness.
Well, and I'll just say, that really resonates with that moment where Kaplan is saying what he thinks is the problem of the reformist and neo-Orthodox Judaism of his time, which of course are different from the ones today, where he says, look, not only do they not have a philosophy of why anti-Semitism happens, they don't have a counter philosophy that actually gives a rich account of how we're supposed to respond. And I think that really resonates today.
So there's really only time for one other question before I turn it over to Jeffrey. And I think it's an appropriate question because it kind of flows from many of the things that you've said, Elias, and definitely a number of the things that you also said, Deborah, when you were describing, particularly current Israeli political reality, which is, you both have noted that in Kaplan's conception of Judaism, there's this vision of a pluralistic Jewish community. But what are we to do with, the growing number, perhaps, of Jewish groups that in their conception of Jewish peoplehood don't have room for the type of Jewish conceptions and definitions that are prevalent within liberal Jewish circles, many of which see Kaplan as a spiritual father. So how do we deal with the fact that we perhaps want to bring them in, although that might itself be questionable, and on the other hand, they don't want to recognize us. They kind of delegitimize us. How does pluralism function in this kind of environment?
Eric knows that I welcome this question, Rabbi Bob Gluck, a very, very, very wise question. Not that I have answers, but I think it's an urgent question of the moment. Kaplan is located within the tradition of liberalism, which is a major response, emerged out of modernity. And even as he was really much more communitarian, after Emil Durkheim was much more communitarian focused. And this is a crisis of liberalism right now, I think. And I think it has everything to do with the rise of supremacist, chauvinist, ethnocentric governments around the world. So I welcome the question, because I think it is absolutely essential that we try to figure it out in our own world, and in a way, hopefully in a way that might help the rest of the world, and for sure drawing on the wisdom of those other people who are looking to determine this. I feel very clear. This is when I really try to invoke Kaplan a lot. I feel very clear that we are living, as I said, in this inter period, and that it is incumbent on us to midwife something new. That what had been working there were fissures and fractures. 2016, at least in America, absolutely was quite devastating to that post-Cold War liberal consensus that where we presumed ever greater acceptance and inclusion. And October 7th and everything that's followed it's just shattered down. So it's just come tumbling down around us. So there's stuff that we have to pick up from the ruins around us, and there is stuff that we are going to have to create. And this question is an urgent question. How do we do this, and so that we are not delegitimized and effaced and squeezed out of space? It's an urgent question.
Yeah. And I'll just say I agree with everything that Deborah said, and the only thing I'll add is I think Kaplan, and this is a painful place to be, but Kaplan in Judaism as a civilization, I think, is also at times willing to dwell in that space of saying, we understand other people's relationship to us differently from how they understand their relationship to us. That exists within his account of the Jewish community. So he actually is not particularly optimistic about the capacity of either Reform Judaism or Orthodox Judaism to be genuinely hospitable to diversity. Kaplan is really worried that a form of Jewish life so invested in religion exclusively or primarily can't help but degenerate into a kind of sectarianism where you're identifying who has the right views and who has the wrong views. And Kaplan is, I think, at moments willing to contemplate the possibility that kind of civilizationally minded Jews are better equipped to find a place for their religiously minded counterparts than religiously minded Jews are to find a space in Judaism for their civilizationally minded counterparts. And it's a painful place to be. It puts us in precisely that place that Deborah mentioned of being midwives for something that hasn't yet come to be. It puts a Kaplanian position of trying to model an acceptance that others might not reciprocate. But I think there's that moment in Kaplan, and I think there's that moment with his relationship also with sort of non-Jewish groups as well. He has a moment where he's imagining why the concept of civilization is useful in American society, and he says, who should really be happy about this? Catholics, because Catholics also run into challenges kind of being pushed to assimilate into a kind of Protestant society. And so actually this kind of notion of civilizationally generated hyphenated identities should be as attractive to Catholics as to Jews. I don't think Kaplan was under any illusions that all Catholics at that moment were going to immediately embrace Kaplan or Jews as partners in that project. But I think he's gesturing towards the idea that we can recognize the potential for common ground in the future that may not exist today.
Thank you again, Deborah and Elias. I want to invite everyone to stay on, if they can, another 10 minutes while we look backwards a bit and forward in the work of the Kaplan Center in the next several webinars. That will leave us well positioned to follow our usual minhag, which is we never kick people out at 4:30 or 4:35. We allow people we'll circle back to some questions. We allow other people to come on with comments. So in terms of looking backwards and forward, Kaplan was fond of the phrase a Copernican revolution and used it in a number of different contexts. You've heard that. Seems to me that when you have a switch in understanding of what Judaism as it is at its core from the civilization, you choose culture, civilization, evolving religious civilization, a number of things change radically. Before his sudden and tragic death, Dan Cederbaum was putting together a conference on Jewish literacy. A number of people who likely would have played a strong role in that conference: Dr. John Levinson of Brandeis, Rabbi Arthur Green of Hebrew College, Dr. Miriam Heller-Stern from the Hebrew Union College community. They will be gracing our Talmud pages, new feature that we've put a lot of energy into at the Kaplan Center website, with their reflection on who counts as an educated Jew once this Copernican revolution has happened and you're no longer defining Judaism as simply religious. I've asked our speakers today, Deborah and Elias, to help kick off a dialogue that you will see on the websites, in the Talmud pages. We want to leave open the question of how you get this knowledge. It isn't necessarily by sitting in a classroom. Perhaps it's by following your passion as a Jewish artist or some form of service learning. However, in the end of the day, I think we can agree it's better to be a knowledgeable Jew than an ignorant Jew. And my dear colleagues, Elias and Deborah, I would love for you to start off this dialogue that will be continued in our Talmud pages by asking you, what is it that a knowledgeable Jew who thinks that Judaism is indeed a culture, a religious culture, an evolving religious civilization, and not simply a religion, what does that person know? Just a few thoughts to help seed the dialogue. Elias, maybe we'll start with you just to reverse things a bit, and then Deborah.
Great. So thank you so much. It's such an important and big question. For the sake of time, I'm maybe just going to try to flag one thing that I think this knowledgeable Jew needs. Of course, there are many others. I think that part of what this knowledgeable Jew described by Jeffrey needs is to maybe know something about the broader world in which Jewish life exists and the disciplines and intellectual resources that we have in the modern period for making sense of that world. So as I mentioned earlier, Kaplan really thinks that it's crucial that our vision of Jewish life address issues that matter most to contemporary Jews, that it kind of provide concrete, meaningful guidance regarding how to wrestle with today's most challenging problems. And if that's the case, then the knowledgeable Jew needs to have quite a profound understanding of the broader world from which those challenges emerge, right? If we're going to play a role in shaping the future of this evolving Jewish civilization, we need to have a much better sense of the world in which that Jewish civilization exists and evolves and changes, and the challenges and questions it poses. I think we need to become sociologists. We need to immerse ourselves in the long-term trends shaping, say, group affiliation in the United States, such that the implications of those trends for Jewish life can be recognized and addressed. We need to be versed in that literature on post-ethnicity that Deborah mentioned earlier. We need to become theorists and scholars of religion. We need to be aware of the diverse roles that religious practices can play in facilitating connections and meaning-making and community among individuals in a pluralistic 21st century democracy, such that an awareness of those roles can shape ritual innovations we pursue. We need to be well-versed in, say, scholarly literature and what's often called lived religion, which looks at how religion functions in the everyday lives of individuals and communities. I think we might need to become political scientists and political theorists, aware of the political trends shaping the societies we inhabit, such that we can build communal structures that speak to the needs emerging from those trends. We need to become versed, say, in literature on threats to democracy or political polarization across educational lines, such that we can build Jewish communities that are not only kind of resilient enough to weather challenges emerging from these developments, but also capable of constructively addressing them. And so I think this is one key aspect of what a knowledgeable Jew along the lines described by Jeffrey is going to need to know. I think the knowledgeable Jew needs to know something about the global context of Jewish life today. Sociology, ethnography, political science, religious studies. I think all of that now has to be part of Jewish learning. If in the Middle Ages, Maimonides thought that the knowledgeable Jew needed to be immersed in Aristotelian science, I think today the knowledgeable Jew needs to be immersed in the liberal arts.
Thank you, Elias. Deborah?
If the questions that Eric asked were part of like my day job, that question really is part of Ellie's day job. That was great. What I'm going to add to everything he said is a community, because they're knowledgeable or ignorant, one cannot be fully Jewish without being in relationship and in conversation with others. I take the mitzvah, the commandment of minyan, which religiously, I understand it as lifted up from the religious underpinnings, and as a call toward mutual obligation. And so the commitment to diversity, Kaplan said, everybody finds their own way in. That's why he didn't want to prescribe. And so whether there's any individual who would do everything that Elias just laid out, or a collection of individuals who are doing it, it is in community, in the sharing, in the pooling, in the pushing and the pulling, and the ways that we can contribute, and the ways that we are transformed, where we can't really imagine. So I think that, and that's where the intergenerational conversation happens with the people around us, ideally with the multi-generational people, and ideally with people who are not exactly like us. And that's the horizontal conversation, also the vertical conversation, all that came before, and with an eye toward all that follows. So I do think that even as, you can't see, my bookshelves are over here, Elias's are behind him, even as the learning is so important, it is the conversation and the community to bring it to life.
Great. Well, I think those are wonderful building blocks for Drs. Green, Levinson, and Heller Stern to work from. Thank you for helping to create that. And I'm going to ask our very fine webmaster and creative communication consultant, Rabbi Margie Jacobs, to help me help you take a look back and then a look forward in where we have been as the Kaplan Center. First, a quick look back to a month ago. So it is very, very hard to believe that it was exactly 1 month ago that we had the benefit of the wisdom, the scholarship, perhaps most of all, the mentlichkeit of Rabbi Dr. David Ellenson. We will miss him a great deal in the Kaplanian community. He was a devoted Kaplanian. So we note that, and as Deborah and Elias shared with us, they dedicated this teaching to his memory, and as a whole, the Kaplan Center embraces that. Next, we want to look ahead to January the 7th, which is our next webinar. And we call that the Kaplanian Report Card. In the same volume, Judaism as a Civilization, Kaplan outlines 5 broad goals for Jewish living and learning. And we're going to ask people who have lived with that charge, who will be our guests at the next webinar. That would be Rabbi Amy Bernstein from Kehillat Israel, who inherits a congregation that was formed out of the relationship between Abe Winokur and Mordecai Kaplan, and Dr. Rabbi Ed Feinstein from Valley Beth Shalom, the emeritus rabbi who worked for decades with Harold Schulweis, one of Kaplan's main disciples. They will be exploring with us where the Kaplanian construct, first of all, how we've done in relationship to these 5 goals, even more how the Kaplanian construct has guided them and has proved so beneficial in the world of Gashmiut, of real congregational life, and where the construct doesn't seem to be able to address, as was indicated before, all the challenges of contemporary Jewish life. So we invite you to be with us. I think Margie is now going to give you the link where you can register for that website, to that webinar, as we hope you will. We want to thank the host of people that helped make this webinar as rich, of course, primarily Elias and Deborah for their rich comments, but also for the flagging of questions that came from Eric Kaplan. We're going to return to Eric in just a moment. And for the help we got from Caitlin and Jane and other members of the Kaplan Center Board, and Mel for his gracious introductions. We do want to allow people who, you've been with us till now, you're Yahzeit, in the words of the Mishnah. You've fulfilled your obligation for Jewish study. Go light your Hanukah and have a wonderful Hanukah. But if you're curious and you have the time, I think there's 45 or so of you that do, we can return to Eric and a few more questions and actually allow some people also to share some responses to the webinar, again, as is our custom. Eric, would you like to continue some of those dialogues with a question or two?
Sure. Well, looking at the ones that we didn't, that I didn't get to the first time around, that I'll just throw out. They have to do with kind of specific questions. One is probably, Deborah, you're probably the best suited to take a shot at answering it, which is what role, if any, did our Eisenstein's creative Judaism, which was an attempt to kind of put together a digest, in a sense, of in a more approachable form of some of the key ideas in Judaism as a civilization. What role did that might have in the proliferation of Kaplan's thought, most specifically in North American Judaism? And if either of you want to say something a bit more about Kaplan's relationship to the conservative movement and JTS in particular, since that came up in one of the questions. And I'm going to throw out two things that I was thinking of in the mix, which you can feel free to ignore, but they were in my mind, so I put them down here. One is, Judaism as a civilization. The subtitle in the title, right, is Towards a Reconstruction of Jewish Life. And when they were putting together the Reconstructionist Journal, there was a lot of pushback on the idea of it being the Reconstructionist Journal, because they thought it was a real mouthful as a phrase. But Kaplan insisted on it because he felt that there was a need to make clear the extent of, the fundamental type of rebuilding work that needed to be done here. So my question, the thing I was thinking of, is both for you, Deborah, as a movement leader, and Elias as a publisher and intellectual. Is the term reconstruction, is it overall a hindrance? Does it serve that benefit that he was hoping it would serve? And secondly, the big contribution of Judaism as civilization is Kaplan's idea that moving forward, nothing in Jewish life will succeed if it doesn't bring what he called this worldly salvation. Right? Judaism was held together in the past in large part by the promise of otherworldly salvation. These days, we need to have this worldly salvation. In other words, we have to convince people that Judaism is indeed meaningful and will contribute positively to their lives. And I'm wondering if either of you have any thoughts about how that concept, if it plays any role in the way you approach your work, Elias, in terms of thinking of what books might need to get published, and Deborah, and thinking of what types of programs or initiatives might resonate the most?
That's a lot. And I will let you know, I'm going to have to go about 4:50. So I'll just speak very quickly. Creative Judaism was, as I said, an effort to make Judaism as a civilization more accessible. And there were requests. And my issue, my edition, which someone paid $3 for, I see still written in, there were 4 printings. 36, 41, 53, and 59. So I think it was, but I don't actually come across it. What I saw in my research was that there were many study groups that were established to read through either the book itself, Judaism as a Civilization, or the Reconstructionist when it came out. So I think it was a helpful tool, but I don't think it was hugely influential. I think it was it augmented. I want to say, you asked so much, but I don't, JTS, I would point folks to Jack Wertheimer's article, Kaplan and the Great Do-Nothings, that talk about how, in short, I cut this from my talk, what Reconstructionism shares with the conservative movement is a commitment to this, and to a certain extent with the Reform movement, is a commitment to Wissenschaft des Judentums, of scientific study of Judaism, where Kaplan's approach to diverged from those of the faculty members of the Seminary of Jewish Theological Seminary of America, was that he wanted to act on the implications of the scientific study of Judaism, and where they were still promoting being bound by the halachic process, and so it just made for very very uncomfortable undertakings. About the name, I will share with you when the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College and the Jewish Reconstructionist Federation merged in 2012. A lot of confusion about the name, and it was really clear that we needed to rebrand. And what I was pretty certain that we were going to go in something that used reconstructing, because when you use the noun, Reconstructionism, when you use the adjective, Reconstructionist, there's a lot of blankness. And when you use some form of the verb, we reconstruct Judaism, we are reconstructing Judaism, there are aha moments, even with, for example, presidents of Reconstructionist congregations. Oh, that's what this is about. So, we weren't going to abandon it for sure. Our mission is now our name. Our name is now our mission. I mean, it's been 5 years now, but it's much more lively. And I would say, yes, I think that I don't use the term salvation very much. I know, Eric, you're writing on that. I don't find it helpful. I find it means like it needs a lot of. If I have to explain Reconstructionism, I don't also want to explain what we mean by what salvation might mean. I don't want that many footnotes, but I think that larger aspiration of helping people to be the best possible people, the best possible Jews, the best possible Americans, the best possible citizen of the planet, what Kaplan was trying to do, that's very much in the minds when we are. We try to take the lead from folks themselves, but it very much shapes our programming and our orientation.
Maybe I'll just pick up on that last topic, the topic of salvation, and maybe in particular on something that Deborah just said about taking the lead from folks themselves. I agree the term salvation itself is probably not a term that I would place at the center of contemporary Jewish conversations, contemporary Jewish publishing, contemporary Jewish intellectual discourse, for a whole variety of reasons. At the same time, I think what's really powerful about that move at the beginning of Judaism as a civilization is Kaplan is doing precisely what Deborah just said, at beginning where at least he thinks that people are, right? Kaplan is beginning with what he, not with where he wants Judaism to be, but with where he thinks Judaism is among the American Jewish community. And he does think that there's been this kind of gaping hole left by the inability of many contemporary Jews to take seriously the otherworldly notions of salvation that he think have often given Jews the self-confidence and commitment to be a part of the civilization. There's a kind of humility about his use of the word salvation at the beginning, where he really thinks that he is honing in on the lived reality of communities. And I think that, to me, is very much actually a model of what people should be doing when trying to contribute to intellectual conversations, when trying to publish books. When we try to intervene in broader conversations, when we try to write something, on some level, we're doing it for ourselves, but more importantly, we're doing it for other people. We're trying to make a difference. And that means we need to begin not just by writing what we want to hear, but by beginning where other people are and writing something and saying something that's going to resonate with them. And I think that although the content of what happens at the beginning of Judaism, the civilization, might not speak to everyone today, I think the form, the kind of humility of setting aside some of his own concerns and trying to begin where people are is, I think, a really powerful model for us today.
Well, thank you. Thanks to both. And my job here is done, but I know there's still 26, 27 people or so online, and Deborah said she could be here for a few extra minutes, but not too many more. But if somebody has some things that they wanted to ask Elias or Deborah that's not in the chat, because I think we got to everything that was there, now's your time.
And Eric, may I just add, this is Jeffrey, that we love to get feedback about the richness that people draw out of the webinars or something else we might have done. I am a great devotee of the observation of Paul Tillich, the Protestant theologian, that the classical pedagogic error is throwing answers like stones at people who haven't asked the question. Well, we've thrown some rich content at you, we hope, and we're curious whether how that sat with you, what kind of meaning you've derived from this December webinar. So what we do now is we ask people to, Mel, I see your hands raised and we'll turn to you. In general, if you can, Mel literally raised his hand. If you can raise your digital hand, you'll come to the top of the screen, and a further question or some comments about what you're drawing out of today's work. So Mel, please.
Okay, I just want to take off from what Elias was saying about civilization and salvation, and the fact that salvation is not an adequate notion. I disagree with that a little bit, but I think one can turn to the concept of need, N-E-E-D. Kaplan discovered Maslow, Abraham Maslow, and Erich Fromm in the middle of the 20th century. And he actually met Maslow at one point, who was teaching at Brandeis at that point. And Maslow has a hierarchy of need, going from our basic needs for food and sleep, which as an older person is a problem, going up the scale for community, and he ends up with the need to be altruistic as the highest need that a person can get to. So I want to mention my discovery of a young man in Israel who I hope to introduce to our community, who is Haredi. He has earlocks, he davens every morning, and he is completely observant. And at the same time, he is a dedicated Kaplanian. So in terms of the matter of diversity, which we talked to, I've only discovered this one person, but the point is that he kind of metaphorically stands for the fact that it is possible to be Haredi, to be traditional, and to be Kaplanian at the same time. I see Deborah is making a face, but I assure you, he publishes on Facebook all the time, and it amazes me the degree of his devotion to Kaplan. So,
Deborah, you want to explain your face?
I was typing a goodbye chat to everyone. That's all. My concentration was just a little bit distracted. I apologize. So thanks to everyone and to you, Mel. I'll finish typing.
But in terms of diversity,
and people may not have seen in the chat a couple comments of praise, the very Shevach. That was wonderful, rich seminar. We pass that on to the people that helped make that possible. And we still invite perhaps one or two more people, if they would like, to come forward and raise your hand and share with us a response to the seminar, or a question perhaps that the seminar has put in your mind that you'll be thinking about for a while. So. Well, I believe in the wisdom of the song Dayenu, that this has been a very rich couple hours and maybe enough to allow you to keep percolating and thinking about these things. We always provide space on our website for people to make comments. It's part of our Talmud tradition, and perhaps you will have some you want to share about this particular webinar. So I think I should end it as I began it, with a Hanukah Sameach. Have a great Hanukkah, and may you discover as many brilliant lights in those candles as we had moments of insight today. So thank you, and we'll conclude the webinar.